Hi there, welcome to this interview that I'm doing today. I'm Yeshe Matthews of the Mount Shasta Goddess Temple, and I'm interviewing one of the priestesses of the temple, Rayna Temple Bee, also known as Traci Ardren. She is a professor at the University of Miami and a scholar of the culture of the Maya. And she is going to be talking with us today about Mayan culture as well as about the goddess Ix Chel, or sometimes called Chac Chel, and we'll be kind of unpacking a little bit about this goddess of divination and so much more during our interview. Thank you so much for being here today, Rayna.
You.
Well, let's get right into it. I wanted to know first, how did you get your start studying Maya culture, and how long have you been studying it?
I took a class as an undergraduate, like a freshman year, in archaeology, anthropology. I ended up at a small liberal arts college. I knew anthropology was something I wanted to do because I love to travel. My family had traveled a lot. And I thought, I've been a student of Native American culture, and I just thought, okay, this is where I'm going to get a little deeper with this subject. So I took an introduction to archaeology class, and the person teaching it happened to be a Mayanist scholar, right? So he'd grown up in Mexico, he worked in Yucatan, and I was just floored by the fact that I'd grown up in Florida on the other side of the Gulf of Mexico from this amazing culture, civilization really, and knew nothing about it, like had heard virtually nothing about this amazing, amazing culture that was only a few hundred kilometers away. So I was hooked for that reason. And then, so I was, I guess, about 19 or so at that point. So quite a long time ago, over 30 years ago. And then I eventually decided to stick with it because I realized being interested in gender roles, being interested in religion, religious belief. I was a witch before I went to college. So all of this was in service of my witchiness. Maya culture was really perfect for me because it has the classic period, at least the ancient Maya have this written history. They have a very rich artistic record, and they have archaeology, or the material evidence. And so with all of those together, you can really ask interesting questions.
Well, I'm excited for us to unpack some of these interesting questions today. So we heard a little bit about your work in the Yucatan. You live, saying like you live just a few hundred kilometers from Yucatan. Where are the Maya located, kind of culturally, historically? Other than there, I know they're sort of everywhere. I've heard a lot of different places. Can you help us understand that?
Absolutely. So we talk about the Maya as living in southern Mexico and Mesoamerica. So Mesoamerica is a word that just means Middle America. It basically includes Mexico down through almost all of Central America. Some people disagree on what that border is. And the Maya people lived in southern part of Mexico. So where the bow tie of Mexico is, down like through the Yucatan Peninsula, and then into Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, or at least the western part of Honduras, and El Salvador. So it's kind of upper Central America and lower Mexico. And today, one just little add to that, there are large numbers of Maya people outside of Mesoamerica. So there's a big Mayan diaspora. There's a large population in Vancouver. There's a large population in San Francisco and in Florida. A lot of those are Guatemalan people who fled during the Civil War.
Gotcha. So this is, in terms of some of the things that we've heard about, as sort of most notably like the 2012 event, Mayan calendar kind of thing, we can start to see kind of a little bit about why those names kind of have reached into so many different places, like in North America and beyond, as a result of that diaspora, and then all the kinds of legends that crop up, whether true or not, about them and their ancient culture. So I was hoping you might be able to kind of shed a little bit of light on the lives of the ancient Maya people, and particularly the women. We want to hear about everybody, but particularly what was life like for women of the Maya.
Sure, that's one of my favorite topics to talk about. The first book I ever edited was a book called Ancient Maya Women, which was the first one to talk about the lives of women. So just to set the stage, I want to be clear that we talk about ancient Maya and modern Maya. The people living in this part of the world today, speaking Maya languages, of which there are like 25 different languages, they are the direct descendants of the people who built the ancient culture. And archaeologists primarily focus on the ancient culture, the pyramids, the palaces, the burials, but we are expected to know about modern Maya culture in order to inform the archaeology. And then increasingly there are contemporary Maya people who are also archaeologists who do the same kind of work and use their own cultural skills to interpret the archaeology. So just to say that there, of course, are tremendous changes that occurred during the colonization of Mesoamerica, but there's a lot of continuity too. And that's important for this question because modern Maya people still preserve a lot of emphasis on gender complementarity is the best word for it. So they have a sense that the world, the universe works best with two genders that work in concert. There may have been more than two genders. Quite likely there were, because throughout the Americas, there were more than two genders. But our best evidence, at least for the classic period, which is 200 AD until about 900 AD, are these two genders. And that's still a big part of Maya culture today. So when we talk about ancient Maya women, one thing we can do is look at how Maya women today talk about their lives and the kinds of things they do and see what continuities there are. So one of the things that's very similar is that Maya people expect women to be very good at the domestic arts. So I like to think of that include things that take raw materials and turn them into finished culture. So they are expected to be naturally good at cooking and high cuisine. They're expected to be naturally good at weaving and textile arts. They're expected to be naturally good at herbal healing and care for small children and domestic animals, and other kinds of art as well. So that doesn't mean that men don't do those things occasionally, of course, or that women are not allowed to do other things. It's just a generalized expectation. And those are complementary to the kinds of things that men are expected to be good at. And so, for example, one of the ways that plays out now is that a lot of Maya-speaking people today, the women will go and do domestic work in hotels in Cancun, like where I work, because even though that's away from the home, it fits the general expectation that domestic work is something that women are good at. Whereas the expectation for men is that they're good at working in the cornfields and the milpa and growing things and building things. And so men will gravitate towards those sorts of jobs. If they're going to leave their traditional village, they may do construction work in Cancun or something like that. But in terms of the ancient world, we know that it was a very hierarchical culture. So there were semi-divine royals at the top, very similar in some ways to Egyptian royalty in the sense that they were truly believed to not be gods, but to have divine blood in their bodies and the ability to speak to ancestors and gods at a heightened level. And so there were many, many priestesses who are depicted in the art. It was a part of the expectation if you were a royal woman that you would know how to speak to your own ancestors, how to summon them, how to ask for their aid or in war or in other kinds of activities as well, to also know divination, to really embody this sense of creation. So the ancient women, the priestesses in particular, are shown very elaborate clothing, very elaborate jewelry, very elaborate tattooing or scarification on their faces, sometimes very elaborate hair. All of this was like performing, enacting, right, their role as creators of culture and embodiments of that value. So then there was a very large percentage of the population who lived outside the palace and supported the life of those elites. And those women were farmers. They raised deer. There's some controversy over whether the deer were fully domesticated, but the deer were allowed to graze on household gardens that women were in charge of. So there was a very close relationship with deer. There's even some imagery of women allowing deer to nurse off their breast, which the Spanish also mentioned. And for a long time, I thought, oh, that's one of those weird Spanish fantasies. But then I've done the research, and there are images. There's like a handful, half a dozen figurines. Sometimes a woman's holding a baby, sometimes she's holding a deer. So there's a thing that's going on between deer and humans there also. So those women were helping with growing the vast amounts of corn that were needed to keep that culture going. They had these household gardens, which were full of all kinds of fruits that we know and love today, like avocados and guavas, and sapote and papaya. And then they were processing that food. They were creating art in the form of textiles and pottery, and they were raising families and raising small children.
Wow, there's so much there. The thought of, of course, that and why would it be different that ancient women being just as busy as modern women, having to do all the, but the real deal breaker for me there was like, it broke my mind, was the thought of how many people now try to keep the deer from eating their gardens. And what might be possible if we just said, well, I'll plant a garden that's for the deer and give it to them, how different our relationship with deer might be. There's something really powerful about this women and deer image. I'm fascinated by it. So, as culture creators, as food producers, as life givers, and as diviners in the royal houses, and as, priestesses, obviously Maya women had and still have to this day a very strong role as the backbone of major aspects of society. And do you find that this is also reflected in the goddesses of the Maya? For example, what was the view of Maya goddesses as far as we can tell? Were they monist? Were they polytheist? Were they animistic? Were they pantheistic? What were some of the more important earthly and cosmological functions of the goddesses of the Maya?
Yeah, well, there was definitely a pantheon of deities, and we have a hard time sorting some of this out because the Maya had a very sophisticated writing system during the classic period, but they did not really choose to use writing to record their mythology. So the writing was dedicated really to sort of historical documents, the recounting of the accomplishments of kings and queens, dynastic history. And occasionally bits and pieces of the mythology would slip in, but usually that was just portrayed visually in art. And so we have a hard time sometimes knowing exactly what's going on. But there were a variety of deities, including at the top a creator couple. So like many places in the world, creation was seen as a grandmother and a grandfather, basically. And those two were completely equal and both necessary for life to exist. And so they're still around and petitioned, especially by the Guatemalan daykeepers who uphold that tradition. And then from there were a series of different deities who evolve over time, but relate very much to the processes of the earth that are going on in that area. So there's a god who I call the maize deity, because that figure seems to play with gender and not fully embody masculine ideals, and also embodies some feminine ideals, and cross-dressing in using costume elements that are female with elements that are male is part of the way that the royals would perform the maize deity. So, and maize as a plant is dual gendered. And so there's lots of things going on with that. And then there were heroes who became almost deified or models of good behavior. And then the world of goddesses, we have kind of conflicting evidence. So one of the reasons I haven't written more on this topic is that we're still trying to sort a lot of this out. We have what the Spanish said, who, of course, in the 16th century were trying to convert these people. And so they had a very clear and specific agenda, which was not necessarily to accurately describe what was going on, right? So occasionally they were accurate, mostly they were just angry, but we get bits and pieces from that. And then we try and take that and push it back a few hundred years to the classic period art, which was very plentiful, but died out really around 1100 or so. So many hundreds of years between what the Spanish wrote down and what the vast majority of the art it dates to. And so we know there was a moon goddess. We don't know her name, and we don't understand exactly what she did. She appears in contemporary Maya mythology as a partner of the sun. And she seems to be in classic Maya art, very young, very beautiful, very sexually tempting, because there's definitely an emphasis in the art. Since the art was not made by free artists, it was made only in service to the state. The art there shows female sexuality as something that is dangerous. It is alluring and seductive and potentially disastrous. So in my reading, this is something I've written about, that is because reproduction was being controlled by the state, or the state was so invested in the reproduction of elites, right? So they really emphasize this need to control female sexuality, but yet also acknowledging the power of it, right? It's true. This is the part that my male colleagues generally miss, but like, it can't be so life destroying if it's not fundamentally super, super powerful and potent, right? So that seems to be part of what the moon goddess was. The Spanish documents mention a variety of deities. Ix Chel is one of them, and as a healer, as a goddess of that women would travel to who were trying to become pregnant, and as a weaver. And then Chac Chel, who was the older version of that same deity, probably, who had more of the sort of creator, like the grandmother creator energy, is the way I see her a lot of times. I have my own personal spiritual work with those deities, which has informed me as much as anything, because the sort of data on it are very slim. But so I feel that Chac Chel is the older version, the wise grandmother, who's very revered in my culture. There's a very important role for that deity, that person. And we see that still today. And then we see some images of it. There's a couple of beautiful pieces of art from the classic period that show Chac Chel. She's often got jaguar hands, paws, because she's ferocious. And she looks aged. But what I think is going on because of this emphasis on female sexuality is that the postmenopausal woman was much more free to do magic and spiritual work than the reproductive woman. And so younger women were tightly controlled, I think, much more narrow skill set, probably in terms of their ritual life. And then once they had children reproduced, they had sort of secured a level of respect in their community or their dynastic line, if we're talking about the queens. then postmenopausal women could go wild. And the Spanish do write about that. I mean, they could drink, they were doing ritual all the time. The Spanish were very bothered by these older women who were everywhere doing magic and ritual. So Chac Chel, I think, is that. She's a divination deity in the sense that she's tapped into the creative power of the universe. And Ix Chel, as a younger version, is more closely tied to that reproductive energy. And I think that's why her main shrine was on an island. The sea was seen as the source of life for the Maya. Souls went into the sea at death, and then they came out of the sea when they came into life. So there was that ocean energy was important. So that was a lot, but
no, I'm riveted and making so many connections as you're talking. For example, what you just said about the sea, of course, the amniotic fluid is like the ocean within. So it really makes sense that somebody would make that connection, like, oh, this amniotic salty fluid is also like the ocean. It's really impressive, all of the different layers here. One thing that as I'm listening to you, I was thinking about is how, gosh, when you said like reproduction, it was maybe tightly controlled by the state. I was like, oh, we can't get away from this. Just across cultures, across timelines, we cannot get away from the fact that whenever there is a state control of reproduction, it will always mean somehow that women are perceived as containerized and also as dangerous, and that the danger of the women is the reason to containerize them, or that there's this sort of layer there. But I also love this idea of Chac Chel. We see a lot of things about Ix Chel, and you wrote a great article on this, which I'm going to link in the comments. But and I'm also going to link in the comments my interview with Shuni Hiron, a Maya daykeeper and Aki from Guatemala, who has taught me a lot about these pairings of the grandparents. There's different grandparents at each of the 4 directions. There's sort of a central set of grandparents. There's the hero twins. There's all these different beings that come in pairs. So it was really exciting to kind of make the connection between what I've learned from her and then hearing from you about it. But we hear a lot about Ix Chel as the moon goddess, and in your article, you kind of interrogate that supposition, and you kind of take it apart and reveal that there may be something kind of more of wishful thinking there than historical basis. And so although people can go and read the article, and I encourage everyone to, because it's great, I wondered if you might unpack that a little bit more about Ix Chel and this, who decided she was the moon goddess, and where has that all gone? Why do we have that, culturally speaking?
I'm happy to do that briefly. It's and this is a perfect opportunity because it really was my own spiritual work with Ix Chel that led me to do then the academic paper about it, because I thought she was a moon goddess too. I mean, and so I went through my own process of checking myself basically and saying, okay, let me just actually try and be as careful as possible about this. This other culture, not my culture. I'm trying to understand it, not in terms of how it suits my needs, but on its own terms. And that led to then just looking over what the sources actually say and noticing that there was this one particular popular book that was written at a time in which academics wanted to fit the native or indigenous gods of the New World into sort of a Greco-Roman schema. Right? There was a sense like, let's make order out of this disorder that we find and match them all up. So, we're going to create, there's going to be a sun god, and there's going to be a moon goddess, and there's going to be an earth goddess, and there's going to be a god of war. And consciously or not, There's one scholar, J. Eric S. Thompson, who wrote a number of popular books, imposed an order on Maya deities that really wasn't there. And I think the biggest mistake was deciding there had to be a moon goddess, and that goddess had to be the partner of the sun, and then choosing that name, even though that's not anything that's ever been found in either the hieroglyphic inscriptions or the Spanish documents or anything else. But it made, common sense. And I think that's one of the things we have to be careful about. It's what's fun about doing academic research as well as having personal gnosis, is that we want to follow our gut sometimes, but we also don't want to just take an easy way out, right? And I think it was easy to see a moon goddess because we meaning Western culture people, expect there to be a moon goddess. So there was a classic Maya moon goddess. We just don't know much about her yet. I think we will sort that out. But Ix Chel is not her. Ix Chel is something different.
I think this is such an important thing that you're pointing to, which is that one, that just because there is an ancient basis for a particular cultural understanding does not mean that we can just overlay that awareness or that basis onto a culture that did not arise from within that same matrix. And it seems like it's something that would go without saying in one way, because it's like apples to oranges. But in another way, I think that many Western scholars kind of think of themselves as the only scholars and kind of think of their basis as an invisible truth that is just presumptive. That if there is a sun god, there must be a moon goddess. And actually, that's really not the case in a lot of cultures. In a lot of different cultures I've encountered, the female is solar and the male is lunar, or sometimes they're both all of it. Or like as in the maize deity, I love that. In my mind, I'm kind of like envisioning these councils of grandmothers and grandfathers being like, well, obviously the maize deity is one of ours because we can use all of the fibers to do all of this, important work. And then somebody else saying, well, obviously, no, the maize deity is one of ours because nourishing and feeding the people, and coming to the awareness that the maize deity is so important that they belong to everybody, that they're one of everybody. So I think there's something really important here about analyzing our hidden cultural biases, and especially our hidden intellectual biases that sort of presuppose that the schema in which we're working is the universal schema. So thank you for pointing to that. And as I mentioned, I'll link to the article below. It's great. And I also felt like, as you were talking before about Chac Chel, you mentioned, she's the goddess of divination because she's the goddess who's allowed to do magic. She's the postmenopausal woman. She's the uncontained woman. She's the ritualista. She's the wild woman. She does what she wants. She drinks. She, does what spirit calls her to do. And I really do resonate with that as I'm going through my change of life, of just so many women describe feeling like at a certain point around the time of perimenopause or menopause, that's when they get really free, because there's sort of no longer certain cultural expectations. Of course, obviously for people who have cramps and stuff like that, then you get a relief from that. But there's also kind of this idea that it's like by then you really know what you know, and no one can stop you from knowing it. And that kind of seems to transcend a lot of different cultures. Wild older women doing their thing seems to really transcend a lot of different cultures, and I think is very relevant to our temple, where we have so many women who are in that like 35 to 60 age range. But I did want to see if we could unpack Chac Chel as a goddess of divination. Are there any symbols associated with her? Like when we see her, how do we know that divination and magic is part of her her jam just from looking at the images of her?
Well, that's a little bit more challenging for sure. I think we like, as in my academic brain, I'm comfortable saying she's a deity of creation. And so I'm kind of making the leap then to divination, because we, and in an academic perspective, think that divination was baked into everything that classic mind people were doing. They created almanacs, they were watching astronomy and astrology, they had a whole system of astrology. There was a lot of calendar work, numerology, just so much built in. I don't know if I exactly know how this connects, but one of the really interesting things to mention to the Temple sisters about the Mayan calendar is that that would be a whole discussion because it's very complex, but there are two basic calendars that work in concert. And the 260-day one is the holy calendar. And 260 days is the length of human gestation. So people have pointed out that the whole thing is about the creation of life in one perspective, and female power in that sense, fertility. So I think in terms of specifically Chac Chel, I mean, the Chel is a rainbow. So the rainbow sign being a bridge and being so all-encompassing is one of her symbols that we can work with for sure. She's often shown with these ferocious claws and maybe even jaguar powers. The ability to transform into a jaguar is what's suggested, which is the oldest shamanic image in Mesoamerica, going all the way back to like 2000 BC. The Olmec were creating images of people transforming into jaguars. So big cat transformation, half animal, half human, shamanic journeying in the spirit of an animal, like transforming into animals or having a companion spirit animal. All of that shamanic power shows up in her iconography. So I feel like that's a big part of what we know about her. And in terms of actual divination, I think probably modern day keepers would be able to tell us more than I can about the divination part of it.
Well, I do know that Shuni has talked about doing a form of geomantic divination with seeds that is sort of a protected secret. And there are other cultures on Earth that use as sort of a similar geomantic divination. In our class, we studied geomancy and discovered that geomancy is actually a very old system that is at the heart of many other systems. So I wouldn't be surprised to find something like that. And I loved that you were sharing about how, the calendrical system is based on, in the holy year, is based on the gestation of a single human life. And it's sort of amazing to me that despite the fact that we have scheduled this interview and tried to do it before, we had all these obstacles until today, the summer solstice, when it's kind of just the perfect timing. And in the Kije Maya calendar today, it is Kip Toch, which is number 2 and the sign of the offering. So 2 is about coming together, and about the polarities that we were discussing earlier, and Toch is about making your offering. And it's ancestral. It's, you make an offering to the spirits of the land, but you also make an offering to your ancestral lines. And so there's something kind of interesting here, just even about the day that we're getting to do this today, that has been ordained, that it was ordained that it would happen today. And I, as an amateur daykeeper, very amateur, I've spent the past, maybe since just 2018, really studying this. So I'm just still a really beginner. But I have noticed that whenever I experience certain kinds of things, there will be like a flavor, and I think, let me look up what's today. And then here we are. So thank you for sharing that. And I agree with you that, especially when the female body goes through menopause, our form of creation is no less potent, but it's different than it was before. And so to channel that form of creation into community sustaining magics, into healing magics, it's, what do you do with all that energy that you gave to your babies when they're not babies and you're not having babies? What do you do with all that life force energy? And it's that you benefit everyone. So I really appreciated that Gnostic leap that you made. And I liked to also hear that animistic kind of shape-shifting quality. There's actually in our temple, as you know, we work with Magu and Chiwangmu, and there's actually a similar shape-shifting quality to Chiwangmu. She transforms into a tiger. And in Taoist texts and Taoist literature, she's depicted sometimes as having very sharp teeth and a tiger's tail peeking out from under her skirt. So there's just
that's great,
interesting, cool, big cat energy, that we wield as women. And I think it's, and also, of course, we have Hathor, Bastet. There's plenty of big cat energy if you really looking in various different cultures. So it's nice to hear about that from this academic perspective and also from your magical perspective. Well, this has been so great, and I'm so grateful that you gave us this time today. If there was anything else that you wanted us to know, anything that you felt would be important for somebody who wanted to go further with this subject, what would you recommend?
Well, I think the perfect book is not really out there on goddesses, for
Not
sure.
until you write it.
Not until I write it. I am putting the finishing touches on a popular book about ancient Maya culture that will be probably a good starting point for people interested in that. I think the Popol Vuh is a really important thing to know about. So there's a beautiful animated version of the Popol Vuh myth, which is the creation myth of the Maya that was written down in the 16th century, but probably is hundreds and hundreds of years older than that. And a woman named Patricia Amlin took images from classic art and literally traced them onto gels and then animated it. And it's available online. You can find it Populvuh. And I think that's a beautiful starting point. And after that, I think we're just going to have to create it ourselves, because there's a lot of academic stuff out there, none of which really deal with the goddesses in much depth. I mean, unfortunately, there's still a lot of androcentrism in academia, and people are not that interested. I have, a lot of male colleagues, but I'm going to keep working, and we'll keep talking, and I'm sure your work will make more of this information surface, and it'll be more.
Well, I have to say, as our temple has so many amazing women in it. Undoubtedly, there are going to be more and more women who are interested in this. And particularly, I would just like to say, for women in our temple and beyond who might be watching this now or later at some point, that there's a really powerful opportunity here to connect with one's own lineage and to allow oneself to have the personal gnosis that is available through devotional work. And that I do believe that, for example, when we as priestesses, as diviners, as magic women do our devotional work in the world, it actually helps archaeologists, because if you have enough people praying, Aphrodite, Aphrodite, come to us, come to us, come to us, a statue will be unearthed somewhere within the next few months. If you have a bunch of magic women who call out to a goddess and say, presence yourself among us now, we need you. It's been my experience that they do show up, and that they show up for us in our visions, our meditations, but that they show up for us all by also revealing some of their hidden treasures that were previously unknown or undiscovered. So I hope that our work today, our humble Kievtov, or our humble Kievtov offering today is in doing this video is going to make sure that, you know, Chac Chel hears us with her kitty ears and says, okay, I'm ready. You know, I'm gonna unearth something for you. Let me throw you a bone here. I want to say thank you so much. And I do think there's one other interesting thing. I will find that link and I'll include it in the comments of the Popol Vuh animated piece. I think that'll be so fun to watch and enlightening. And I think it's really interesting that you would mention it because of course it's a very important book. But as I mentioned, my day keeping teacher, Shuni, she actually spends a portion of each year in Chicago, Illinois, living near the place where the Popol Vuh is now kept as a guardian. So as a priestess, a Maya priestess on earth, she took it on herself to leave Guatemala and to go and get an apartment in Chicago so that she can be near the book and basically protect it with her magic. And so maybe there's some time in the future when all of us will get together and get to go see it together because she has access. She's allowed to go look at it and interact with it. So it would be really fun little field trip. Thank you, Traci Ardren, Rayna Temple Bee. We love you. So grateful for this time today. And for all of you watching, I hope that this has opened up your awareness a little bit more about Ix Chel, Chac Chel, and how we live and create myth in this world, both academically and magically. Have a good one.